They weren't legends. They weren't selling out arenas. In the early 1970s, AC/DC was just another struggling rock band clawing for attention in smoky bars and run-down pubs across Australia. Most nights the crowds were tiny, sometimes a dozen people nursing beers, sometimes only 2 or 3. The money was so bad it barely covered gas for their beat-up van. Paying rent or putting food on the table was often a question mark. And then there was the lineup. It felt like a revolving door. Drummers, bassists, even vocalists, musicians came and went, sometimes quitting after just a few weeks when they realized the grind was endless. For most bands, that kind of instability would have been the nail in the coffin, but not for Angus and Malcolm Young. These two brothers weren't interested in easy roads. They were obsessed with music. Malcolm was only 20, Angus just 18, yet they carried themselves with the stubbornness of veterans. Night after night, they plugged in their guitars, blasted out their riffs, and treated every tiny crowd like it was Madison Square Garden. The problem? Their sound was raw. Too raw for the industry at the time. Record labels wanted safe pop songs that could slip neatly onto the radio. AC/DC gave them thunderous guitars and snarling vocals. Radio programmers didn't know what to do with it. Record executives passed them over. To most of the music world, AC/DC wasn't a bet worth making, but rejection only lit the fire hotter. Every gig became a war. Angus, in his now iconic schoolboy uniform, would thrash across the stage, duck-walking and sweating like a man possessed. Malcolm, quieter but just as intense, kept the rhythm like a hammer. They played as if the room was packed, even if only a handful of people were watching. And slowly, that madness caught on. Fans started talking. The reputation spread. AC/DC wasn't polished. They weren't radio-friendly, but they were dangerous. They were different. And the world was about to find out just how far that difference could take them.
Well, they're one of our most iconic musical exports of all time, and this morning we are all feeling the thunder.
By 1975, after years of sweat, rejection, and endless pub gigs, AC/DC finally got their shot. That year, they released High Voltage, the first real album to carry their name beyond the walls of smoky clubs. For Angus and Malcolm Young, this was the moment they had been fighting towards since day one. A chance to prove their sound belonged not just in dive bars, but in record stores across the country. The record was a thunderclap. From the very first riff, it hit with raw electricity. Malcolm's rhythm guitar was like a hammer, Angus's solos cut through like a blade, and Bon Scott's voice, raspy, mischievous, and defiant, wrapped the whole thing in danger. This wasn't polite rock. It was loud, unpolished, and unapologetic. But if the band thought the critics would finally embrace them, they were wrong. The backlash was immediate. Reviewers dismissed High Voltage as crude and obnoxious, calling the songs repetitive and too simple for serious rock. Some even claimed the band was a bad influence on youth, too wild and too reckless for the mainstream. Radio stations hesitated, worried parents would complain, and many in the industry brushed them off as another noisy group destined to burn out quickly. And yet, something about the album broke through. For the fans, High Voltage wasn't noise. It was real. It was alive. The record started to travel far beyond Australia. Word of AC/DC's raw sound spread across borders, and their shows grew larger. No longer confined to backstreet pubs, they were stepping onto real stages, with crowds now shouting the lyrics back at them. But it wasn't smooth sailing. Every step forward came with resistance. AC/DC wasn't polished like their radio rivals. They didn't care about writing safe hits or chasing trends. They were outsiders. They were still fighting against a current that wanted them gone. Still, they had climbed their first mountain. High Voltage was proof that the band couldn't be ignored anymore. But what waited ahead would test them in ways they never imagined.
Great time.
The essence of it. I mean, this is
like
a little Aussie rock band.
That made global headlines.
It worked its way into the heart of people all over the world.
Then came the moment that nearly destroyed everything. On the night of February 18th, 1980, Bon Scott went out drinking in London. It wasn't unusual. Bon had lived fast his whole life, reckless, wild, and fearless. But this night was different. After hours of heavy drinking, he passed out in a car. By the next morning, he was gone. He was only 33 years old. The news ripped through the band like lightning. For AC/DC, it wasn't just losing a singer, it was losing the heart of their sound, the face of their rise, the wild spirit that had turned them into more than just another bar band. Reporters swarmed, headlines screamed, and the band's obituary was practically written overnight. Without Bon, most people believed there could be no AC/DC. For Angus and Malcolm Young, the loss was devastating. Bon had been more than a frontman. He was a brother in spirit, a fighter who had stood beside them through rejection, poverty, and ridicule. He had bled with them on stage and lived the same chaotic, relentless grind. Now, suddenly, he was gone. In those first few days, the question loomed like a shadow. Should AC/DC end here? Most bands would have walked away. Most would have accepted that the story had reached its tragic final chapter. Bon was irreplaceable. The thought of carrying on without him felt impossible. The grief was overwhelming. The world was watching, waiting to see what they would do. But deep down, the young brothers knew something that the press, the critics, and even the fans didn't yet understand. Bon Scott wouldn't have wanted silence. He wouldn't have wanted AC/DC buried with him. And so, in the middle of tragedy, a spark remained. In the weeks after Bon Scott's death, the music world braced for silence. Fans mourned, but deep down, many believed it was over. Record executives quietly stepped back, assuming the band had no future. Journalists didn't hold back. Articles described AC/DC as another tragic footnote in rock history. Even die-hard supporters admitted it was hard to picture the band without Bon's voice tearing through the speakers. The pressure was suffocating. Everything pointed to collapse. The band was grieving, their future was uncertain, and the industry had already buried them. But while the world was ready to close the book, the young brothers weren't done writing. Angus and Malcolm refused to let AC/DC die. They knew Bon Scott would never have wanted his band to fade away in silence. If anything, Bon's spirit demanded the opposite. Keep going, keep fighting, keep the fire alive. So instead of shutting it all down, they made a choice that stunned everyone. They would carry on. Not by replacing Bon, because no one could ever truly replace him, but by finding a way forward. It was a decision filled with risk, doubt, and the weight of the entire rock world watching. And as critics sharpened their knives, AC/DC prepared to gamble their entire future on one last shot. With everything stacked against them, AC/DC made a move no one expected. Instead of walking away, they went hunting for a new frontman. It wasn't about replacing Bon Scott, because that was impossible. It was about survival. It was about honoring what Bon had helped them build and refusing to let his legacy die with him. The search wasn't easy. They needed someone with the grit, the power, and the presence to stand alongside the thunder of Angus and Malcolm's guitars. Most singers would have crumbled under that weight. But then they found Brian Johnson. Johnson wasn't a household name. He came from a smaller British band called Geordie, a group that had never broken through internationally. But Brian had something rare. His voice wasn't smooth or polished. It was raw, raspy, and powerful, like it had been forged out of fire and smoke. It carried the same kind of danger that Bon Scott once did, but with its own edge. The choice was a gamble. Fans could reject him instantly. Critics were waiting to pounce, eager to declare the band finished once and for all. And if the experiment failed, it wouldn't just be the end of AC/DC, it would tarnish the legacy Bon had left behind. But Angus and Malcolm didn't care about the risk. They had spent their whole lives being told they weren't good enough, that they'd never make it. They weren't afraid of doubt anymore. Bringing Brian Johnson into the band wasn't just a decision, it was an act of defiance. And soon the entire world would see just how powerful that gamble would become.
You know what it was, but as soon as they started playing and I was singing with them and everything, you know, there was just, you know, something was happening that I'm not clever enough to tell you what it was, but you know, you could tell, you know, my hairs were standing on end, and you know, it was just, it was fantastic. It was wonderful. I'd never sang with a band this good.
In July 1980, AC/DC answered tragedy with thunder. Their new album, Back in Black, exploded onto the world like a cannon blast. From the very first toll of Hell's Bells, listeners knew this wasn't just another rock record. It was a statement. The album carried the weight of grief, but also the fire of survival. Every song pulsed with defiance. Shoot to Thrill, You Shook Me All Night Long, the crushing power of the title track. This wasn't a band limping forward. This was a band roaring back louder than ever. Most importantly, Back in Black was a tribute. The Young brothers dedicated the album to Bon Scott, carving his memory into every riff and lyric. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a promise. Bon's spirit would live on in their music. Fans embraced it instantly. Brian Johnson, the unknown singer from a forgotten band, was welcomed with open arms. His gritty, soaring voice fit the music like a glove, powerful enough to carry the band's sound into a new era. What many thought would be AC/DC's downfall instead became their greatest triumph, and the numbers told the story. Back in Black didn't just succeed, it rewrote history. Over 50 million copies sold worldwide. It climbed the charts, filled arenas, and forced radio stations, who once turned AC/DC away, to play them non-stop. What had begun as the darkest chapter of their story had transformed into the moment that made them immortal. What was supposed to be the end of AC/DC had become their rebirth. The success of Back in Black did more than save AC/DC. It transformed them into legends. Practically overnight, they went from underdogs fighting for survival to one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. Stadiums sold out across continents. Their shows became massive, larger-than-life spectacles. Angus Young, in his schoolboy uniform, duck-walking across the stage under blinding lights, became one of the most iconic images in rock and roll. Crowds weren't just watching, they were roaring back every lyric. Tens of thousands of voices echoing songs that only months earlier had been born in grief. The energy was electric, unstoppable. What had started in dingy bars in Australia was now filling football stadiums across the world. The loss of Bon Scott would always remain part of their story, but instead of breaking them, it hardened them. The tragedy gave them a kind of unshakable resilience. They had proven that no critic, no setback, and not even death could stop them. With Brian Johnson at the microphone and the Young brothers at the helm, AC/DC became a juggernaut. By the mid-1980s, AC/DC wasn't just another band climbing the charts. They were dominating them. Every album, every tour, every performance was bigger than the last. The same critics who once dismissed them as too simple were now forced to admit the truth. AC/DC had become one of the most powerful rock bands in the world. They had turned pain into fuel, and that fire pushed them into the stratosphere. In the end, AC/DC's story wasn't just about music. It was about survival. From the beginning, they faced every reason to give up: poverty, rejection, ridicule, and finally the crushing loss of Bon Scott. Any one of those blows could have ended them, but it didn't. Instead, they refused to stop. When the world expected silence, they answered with sound, louder, harder, and more defiant than ever. Back in Black wasn't just an album, it was a resurrection. A tribute to Bon, a victory for the band, and a warning to anyone who doubted them. Decades later, it remains one of the best-selling albums in history. Songs like Hell's Bells and You Shook Me All Night Long are still blasting from speakers, still shaking arenas, still alive in the bloodstream of rock and roll. AC/DC proved that greatness isn't about avoiding pain. It's about refusing to let pain stop you. What began in tiny Australian pubs grew into one of the most powerful rock legacies the world has ever seen. Through tragedy, they forged triumph. Through loss, they created immortality, and that is why, against every odd, AC/DC didn't just survive, they became unstoppable. They became legends.